How's it going guys, Chris here, and today we're going to be checking out all the different zombie types in Dead Island 2. This guide's going to be focusing on both the common and apex variants, running through the entire Zompedia from the base game in full detail. Let's go. So probably the most common zombie type you'll find pretty much all over the undead riddled LA is the standard Walker, which is basically the game's vanilla zombie type. These guys can be found pretty much anywhere, and are generally the most popular zombies in the game. Humans that have been completely consumed by the infection and are now wandering the streets, looking for someone's head to munch on. They'll pace towards you, lunge forwards with their arms to try and knock you down, and often grab a hold to try and turn you into their next meal. And because walkers make up the vast majority of the infected population in Los Angeles, you'll see them in many different forms, often depending on what the human was wearing prior to being infected, or the way in which the infecting has genetically altered them, which we'll be exploring more so over the course of the guide. The basic walkers, however, are just cookie cutter enemies with no real strengths or weaknesses, basically cannon fodder, which shouldn't really give you much of a problem, at least until they decide to surround you from all angles, that is. Hacking off those arms will prevent a walker from hitting you, and breaking or chopping off its legs will turn that walker into a crawler, now being a much slower and easier enemy to finish off, while they clamber around on the floor trying to bite your ankles. Another run-of-the-mill enemy you'll find stumbling around in Dead Island 2 is the Shambler, which is basically a walker that's been infected for quite a while and has now started to decompose, probably not helped out by the game's baking hot climate either. These guys are your stereotypical zombies, rotting away in their shredded up clothes, staggering around the place like they've lost a few games of beer pong. They're dopey, clumsy, dumb and super fragile, which is probably what you'd expect from a zombie which is practically falling apart and turning into dust. Being so frail and sluggish, this makes them slower than the walkers, and a very easy opponent to take on, with their attacks and movements being more avoidable, only being able to soak up a few hits themselves before they're taken down for good. Although pretty much any weapon in the game will put them out of their misery fine enough, they are specifically weak to blunt weapons and explosive damage, while having the ability to resist bleed damage down to them having less blood in their veins. Shamblers can still pose a threat, especially when they gang up on you in larger numbers, but they're generally the weakest form of zombie in the game. Some even known to knock their own bloody arms off after hitting you, down to how fragile their bones are. A zombie with the opposite characteristics of the Shambler is the Runner. I guess the clue's in the name with this one. These are essentially the freshest of zombies that haven't really been infected for very long, giving them more strength and speed, making them more effective at hunting their targets down. Runners are fast, agile and trickier to hit, able to climb up ledges and over fences, allowing them to reach areas where other enemies can't. This makes them all the better for chasing after you and covering ground fast, often attracted by loud noises like explosions and gunfire, causing any nearby in the area to come charging over to investigate. Along with waving their arms at you and jumping around in an erratic way, making them deadlier and harder to land hits on, they can also push you back to interrupt your movement, and even dodge your heavy attacks, with those quicker reaction times making slower weapons less effective. It can often be a good strategy to go for the legs and turn it into a crawler, slowing that runner down and massively restricting its movement. And it can also be effective to use your sharp weapons and ones that have extra bleed damage, with runners being easier to deal with when they're sliced to bits. Some of the zombies you'll find in Dead Island 2 have had their once human bodies adapted to ignite, with the virus turning it into a fireball, using flames as a defense mechanism. The virus feeds the fire and keeps it going, while protecting the human host from turning into a big pile of ash, essentially making them a walking candle. These guys are obviously going to be immune to any fire damage, so it's probably a good idea to put those Molotov cocktails away. And they're also going to deal fire damage too upon contact, as you'd naturally expect from something that's on fire. These zombies aren't just going to burn you, but they can also potentially set the environment ablaze too, igniting puddles of fuel on the floor, and even causing nearby gas canisters to explode, making them a bit of a hazard that's definitely best keeping an eye on. You'll therefore want to keep your distance, using ranged weapons when possible, and be a bit more cautious when attacking up close. Maybe shooting nearby water barrels or throwing chem bombs, extinguishing their flames, thus taking away that burn ability. Both walkers and runners have burning variants, with the runners being deadlier, able to get up close and turn you into a crisp more effectively. Though aside from being a bonfire with legs, these burning variants function in the same sort of way as their standard types, only now being on fire, and having flame resistance and damage output to give them a bit of an edge. Some of the walkers and runners you'll come across have been modified by the virus to withstand and deal electrical elemental damage. Zombies which have been exposed to electromagnetic fields typically humans that once worked as electricians or at power stations. Unlike the last variant though, these shock zombies don't just constantly generate energy, but instead build it up over time, only to discharge it in a violent electrical explosion when that charge reaches its full limit. The high voltage blast will affect pretty much anything in the area, including you and other infected, which you'll obviously need to avoid but can sometimes work out in your favour, zapping other zombies for stunning them and dishing out shock damage. You'll need to time your movements and attacks right, getting out of the way when you think that shock variant's about to overload its energy, with that warning indicator giving you a clue on when the energy's starting to build up. You've got to be careful around water with these guys, with that electricity spreading around in any water the zombie makes contact with, like when it steps on a puddle on the floor, also causing the shock variant to discharge its energy early too. Though this can also be used to your advantage, electrocuting other nearby infected, made even easier when you've got those chem bombs equipped, allowing you to trigger those explosions pretty much whenever you want. Speaking of explosions, some other walkers you'll find also happen to be wearing vests strapped up with grenades. These are the Grenadier Walkers, humans that once worked in the military, likely around to help try and prevent the spread of the virus, until they got bitten of course. As you can probably guess, this can potentially make them very dangerous, though they're not smart enough to use those grenades against you themselves, only really being a threat when you dislodge one of those grenade pins through one of your own attacks. This can be done after smacking the vest covering the zombie's torso, triggering the grenade's fuse, now turning that walker into a ticking time bomb. You'll obviously want to get away, outside of the grenade's blast radius, with the explosion dealing massive amounts of damage to both you and other infected nearby. A good idea would be to use your jump kick ability against the Grenadier to send them flying into other zombies, always a nice way to get rid of a bunch at once. If you want to avoid making the zombie go boom, then you're better off attacking the limbs and the head, while trying your best not to whack that vest by accident, which can put you in a pretty awkward situation if you're in a confined space or small room. With that said, it's typically best to trigger the fuse and get the hell out of there before that zombie gets blown to pieces, damaging that vest on purpose through a kick or melee attacks, or even by throwing something at the Grenadier to do so from a safer distance. One of the more common Apex variants you'll find stomping around LA is the Crusher, basically a zombie of a dude who spent most of his life in the gym, helping out a bit by the virus enhancing their muscle structure, giving them even more destructive power. These are the tanks of Dead Island 2, not only soaking up tons of damage, but also capable of inflicting it too, with those massive beefed up arms, being quite slow in nature, but having a lot of strength and durability to make up for it. Crushers are going to throw punches that hit like a truck, and they're going to jump around, slamming the ground to generate shockwaves on the floor to knock you back, shockwaves that you'll need to avoid or jump over. Because these guys rely so heavily on their arms, it's not a bad idea to target those with your weapons, breaking them or hacking them off, weakening the Crusher's attacks, with knocks to the head also being good for chipping away at the Crusher's health. They are resistant to explosives, but are more vulnerable to weapons with bleed damage, plus they're also going to be temporarily exposed after some of their attacks, like the overhead smash, allowing you to run in and go wild with your weapons while they're in that state of vulnerability. Along with the standard big guys, you've also got to contend with the Inferno Crushers, which kind of act like the burning variants of some of the other more common zombies, but now having their arms set alight, capable of dealing burn damage and generating fiery blasts when they do that ground pound. This adds a bit more risk in fights, with the Crusher setting things on fire in the environment such as oil puddles, plus it also lets the zombie ignite you, if too much fire damage is built up with its own attacks. Though just like with the other burning variants, you can extinguish those flames using water or chem bombs, preventing its Inferno abilities, thus making it function more like a basic bog standard Crusher. Now there's quite a few weird Walker variants in Dead Island 2, with the Insect Swarm Walker being right up there. These are essentially infected who've somehow managed to get a hive of zombified bees to nestle within their stomachs, which the Walker can then summon from the nest to attack and infect nearby humans. These walkers like to send clouds of angry bees in your direction, which will surround you, reducing your visibility, while also chipping away at your health and stamina at the same time too. Not good. The actual walkers themselves are more on the docile side, only really lashing out if you get close by, mainly rely on those swarms of insects to do most of the work, which are fairly easy to avoid most of the time, but can still definitely complicate things, when there's quite a few other enemies around that you're trying to deal with as well. Whacking and kicking the swarm of bees isn't really going to do very much, though you can at least use water or a chem bomb to force them to retreat. Though the only way to stop them from coming back is by destroying the hive in the zombie's stomach, or just killing the zombie himself, which is just as good. Another Walker variant you'll see all over the game is the Riot Walker, infected, covered in armour, shielding them from oncoming damage. These guys are your heavy duty zombies, protected from pretty much all of your attacks, whether it be melee based or something thrown or shot. These guys are going to be more resistant to elemental damage too, so that armor can potentially pose a pretty big problem. But thankfully, it can be knocked off after a few hits, leaving the walker vulnerable in that specific area where the armor's been removed. Some Riot gear walkers are only wearing certain bits of their Riot gear, so it's best to aim for the exposed limbs and body parts that aren't being covered to deal damage to those straight away. Failing that, if you come across a dude that's completely kitted out with a full suit and helmet, then you'll need to keep aiming for specific parts to smack off, then allowing you to attack said parts while they're unprotected. These guys can't bite you through that helmet, though they can if you knock it off. Perhaps something to keep in mind if you don't want to get munched on. So aside from having all that protective armor and looking a bit beefy, these Riot gear walkers should be easy to tackle, providing you keep on singling out specific body parts where the zombies have been exposed. A different Apex zombie you'll bump into quite a lot over your journey is the bloated, acid-spewing chunky guy called the Slobber. Basically a newer variant of the floater, right away back from the first game. Slobbers are slow and dopey enemies which mainly rely on their range attacks to hit you over distance, and generally make the area more hazardous by vomiting toxic liquid all over the place. You'll have to dodge out of the way of that caustic bile that comes flying in your direction, all while avoiding puddles of acid it leaves around by its feet, making it trickier to get up close to batter the zombie senseless. Because these guys are so swollen, they're pretty easy targets to hit with your weapons, but actually getting up close to hit them while avoiding getting puked on is another story. And although they are generally more defensive zombies, which primarily rely on launching projectiles over distance, they can still pack a pretty mean punch up close too, also known to grab a hold to have a little dance. A nice tip to know is that these guys are specifically weak to sharp, bladed weapons, and ones with bleed or shock damage, while being resistant to blunt and projectile damage, along with caustic as well, obviously. Aside from the standard acid launching Slobber, there's also a couple of other variants you'll find later on in the game too. One of those variants comes in the form of the Putrefied Slobber, probably one of the nastiest looking enemies in the game, covered in giant zombie leeches which have erupted from their bellies. Instead of vomiting acid, Putrefied Slobbers spit out bile bombs, which stick to surfaces and act as proximity mines, dealing high damage if you get too close. Though unlike the standard version, these guys are immune to bleed damage, due to them having less blood from decaying over time. Otherwise, they're pretty similar to their normal counterpart, trading acid puddles for exploding bombs. The other variant is the Firestorm Slobber, capable of spewing out firebombs, along with organic napalm which spreads all over the floor. Once again, this Slobber functions in a very similar way to the standard variant, only now able to protect themselves in a burning ring of fire, turning the environment into a raging inferno. You might be best using chem bombs to extinguish the flaming vomit on the floor, allowing you to get up close within striking distance, where the Slobber will now rely on melee lunges instead of using those deadly ranged firebombs. It'd be pretty easy to forget to stay hydrated during a zombie apocalypse, but thankfully the next Walker variant serves a nice reminder to do so. The Hydration Walker is definitely one of the more random zombies in the game, wandering around with a pressurized container full of sparkling mineral water strapped to its back. Once there to be sold to customers, but now there to act as a bit of a burden for the poor zombie that's forced to carry it. Because the canister's pressurized, that means that it can explode if it takes a hard knock, sending that zombie flying, extinguishing nearby flames or burning infected types, or just to have a bit of a laugh. Spilling water all over the place can not only deal with fire, but it can also let you create an electrified area when using shock damage. Just be careful not to zap yourself in the process, something you can easily do if you're not paying attention to where those puddles are on the floor. Kinda acting as the opposite to the last zombie, the Incendiary Walker is pretty much the same sort of thing, though replace that water canister with a fuel tank full of gasoline, something that can potentially be a lot more dangerous. These basically act like walking Molotov cocktails, capable of dealing lots of damage to both yourself and other infected nearby, as if you damage the fuel tank on the walker's back, well, it's going to start pissing out gasoline all over the place, creating flammable puddles on the floor, while dousing other zombies close by in fuel, which can then be ignited. Hitting that tank again after it starts leaking will cause it to blow up not long after, signified by a warning indicator, letting you know to stand the hell back. The force of this explosion will be enough to deal lots of burn damage, and it'll also set all the nearby infected on fire, providing that initial blast doesn't kill them outright. Just don't let the walker grab you as it's about to go boom, as they can often have a tendency to try and bring you down with them. If you want to make sure that's not going to happen, you might be better off lobbing something at the tank, or shooting it over range, letting you watch the fireworks from a safer distance. Seems you're in the middle of a bit of a crisis regarding the virus. It's safe to say that you'll run into a lot of infected medical team members and scientists wearing face masks, protective clothing and other forms of PPE. These are the Hazmat Variants, which come in the form of both walkers and runners, acting in a similar way to their standard counterparts, only now rocking that hazmat suit, protecting them from all caustic damage, whether that be dealt from your weapons or other things in the environment. Because these zombies can often be found in areas where there's lots of toxic waste and Caustic-X spilled all over the ground, that protective gear prevents you from using the environment to your advantage, by leading the dumb zombies into traps of acidic puddles, and melting them into a mushy pulp like you'd probably do with some of the others. You'll instead have to revert to good old fashioned bashing and slashing, with that suit giving them no protection against a nasty whack from a heavy chunk of metal. It's not going to protect them from explosions either, nor is it going to save them from the other elemental types like shock or fire damage too, making the hazmat zombies vulnerable to pretty much anything that isn't chemical based. Another Apex variant in the game that loves to make a lot of noise and chaos is the Screamer. Female zombies with mutated lungs, adapted to produce plasma-induced streams of sonic shockwaves by, as the name implies, screaming as loud as they can in your face. This will not only throw you back and give off a bit of a stun effect where your movement becomes slower, but it'll also summon lots of other zombies to the area, causing all the ones around to flip their lid and go into an aggressive frenzied state, which will all surround you and try to turn you into a punching bag. The zombies are going to keep on spawning whenever the Screamer wails, so it's definitely best to shut her up as quick as you can, interrupting those screams by lobbing curveballs and projectiles, or managing to get up close to whack her in the gob with one of your melee weapons. Although they'll mainly rely on other zombies to assist, the Screamers are still pretty good fighters too, despite being so skinny and frail looking, lashing out with those long extended arms and razor sharp talon-like nails. They're weaker to blunt damage, having those brittle bones, so it's therefore a good idea to whip out those hammers and crowbars, to bludgeon the Screamer to death in close range. Blocking will let you wade through the Screamer's shockwaves a tad easier, and using abilities like the War Cry or Dash Strike can also help to interrupt those screams and get up close for a swift attack. Though aside from the standard Screamers though, you'll also meet the Voltaic Variants a little bit later on in the game, which have been altered to produce fields of electricity during their wails, electrifying anything caught in the line of fire. Their shock energy can build up if you're within the area of effect, dealing loads of damage really quickly, giving you more of a reason to avoid the zombie or hurry up and take it down before it zaps away all of your health. Other infected in the area aren't safe to the Voltaic Screamer's electricity either, with a lightning bolt arcing between all of the zombies nearby, putting them in an electrified state, able to shock you if you get too close. This effect also makes these variants super hazardous around water too, making that electricity even more potent, and able to spread more effectively on the floor. Because zombies don't really have a lot of sense or feel pain like humans do, you can expect some of them to run into razor wire or through planes of glass, trying to reach where they want to go. This means that some of the walkers and runners you'll encounter will be covered from head to toe in sharp objects, making them Spiky Variants, with their whole bodies being weaponized from random pointy stuff in the environment. This makes them more dangerous in close quarters as a result, being protected from you touching or kicking them, which will deal some damage to yourself, while also making their melee attacks even stronger, being reinforced by all those sharp bits and pieces, cutting you up and dealing bleed damage as they lash out. Because these Spiky Variants can be pretty deadly up close, you'll need to be extra careful in close range brawls, perhaps even resorting to throwables and guns to help keep a bit of distance from all those brutal spikes. This also means that explosives are going to be extra productive at taking them down without a fuss. You should basically treat them as more threatening versions of the standard variants, having the ability to take you down easier, especially if there's a few around all slapping you at the same time. And it's probably best to prioritise killing the runners as fast as you can, as these guys can close the distance much quicker and will therefore be a lot trickier to keep at bay during a fight, stabbing your feet every time you throw a kick. Instead of putting out fires, these Firefighter Variants are able to just wander on through them, down to their protective suits, shielding pretty much all elemental damage, not just from the flames, but also from shock and caustic things as well. So despite not seeming like something that should pose too much of a problem, that suit actually makes these guys one of the most resistant enemies in the game to any elemental damage, be it stuff in the environment or from your modified weapons, pimped up with those unique damage effects. The entire room's burning down with oil drum canisters leaking out all over the place, the firefighter couldn't care less. Big puddle of electrified water on the floor, zapping the living crap out of anything in the area, the firefighter isn't going to be bothered. Caustic acid splashing out everywhere, forming huge toxic puddles on the floor, the firefighter really couldn't give a rat's ass. These guys might be immune to pretty much all elemental damage, giving them a distinct buff over the hazmats, but they're still not going to be immune from getting whacked in the face, acting like the standard walkers and runners regarding normal melee combat. Of course, there's always going to be that kamikaze zombie that likes to get up close and self-destruct, showering the room in blood and guts while taking one for the team. It wouldn't exactly be a zombie game without one of these guys, would it? The burster does exactly what it says on the tin, bursting as it wanders on by due to it being full of volatile gases and liquids, allowing it to explode as and when it chooses, typically when you're within the blast radius. This essentially makes the zombie a walking bomb, which is often best diffused from a distance, either by shooting them with your guns, probably the most effective way, throwing curveballs through the air, like explosives or shurikens, or by kicking other zombies and using them as a trigger, if one happens to be around at the time. They're specifically weak to shock and projectile damage, and are going to fall over if you lower their stability, causing them to blow up as they flop to the floor. The explosion created by the burster can be deadly towards other zombies too, so not just yourself, and this can be pretty handy when there's quite a few infected around, specifically near to the burster, allowing you to blow them all sky high and deal with multiple enemies at once. Kicking the zombie backwards will also force it to stumble over and explode in a clumsy fashion, though you can still probably get caught within that blast radius when doing so. Generally not the best thing unless you're all out of other options. Now there's one zombie in the game which is actually quite generous, giving you some tasty snacks, after you've taken them down of course. These are the Couriers, which is basically Dead Island 2's version of an Uber Eats driver, carrying a big box of goodies on their back, basically acting as an undead piñata. Because everyone in the game seems to have a diet of protein bars and energy drinks, this is what you can expect to come flying out of those boxes after taking the zombie down, both of which are going to replenish your health, with the drinks in particular also helping to refill that fury meter too. This can literally make the Courier a lifesaver in certain situations, especially when you're low on health with other enemies nearby to deal with. Though the actual zombie itself comes in the form of a runner, which as we know by now can be pretty quick and aggressive. So some of that health you'll be getting back might have actually been taken away by the bloody enemy carrying it, making it a somewhat risky fight, but also a potentially rewarding one too. In a similar way to some of the other zombies which carry elemental canisters, there's also the Caustic-X Walkers, humans that have the task of disposing infected corpses using acidic substances, only to then get infected themselves. They wear similar hazmat suits to some of the others, but also have big tanks of Caustic-X strapped to their backs, which when shot or damaged will start leaking out all over the place, creating hazardous puddles on the floor, melting down anything organic in the area, such as you and other zombies. Of course, with that tank being pressurized, enough damage to it will create a nice green explosion of toxic waste, spreading acid everywhere, thus damaging all of the enemies in close proximity. This isn't going to affect the Caustic-X Walker itself, due to it having that hazmat suit equipped, but it's also a good way of taking down other nearby infected, and making the area deadlier for them to navigate around, unless of course they also happen to be wearing hazmat suits as well. One of the most relentless zombie types in Dead Island 2 is the Butcher, an apex zombie returning from the first game, only now with mutated forearm bones which protrude out of the Butcher's hands in the form of razor-sharp spikes. These guys are very distinctive, clambering around on all fours while rushing in for quick pounce attacks up close. They're easily one of the deadliest enemies in the game, having both speed and power on their side, jabbing at you with those deadly hand skewers while jumping around and evading your strikes. To make fights even trickier, they'll also use those arms to cover themselves and block incoming damage too, being comprised of hardened bone, capable of withstanding pretty much anything you throw at them. You'll have to be careful when going up against Butchers nearby, attacking quickly and carefully, using those dodge and block abilities to try and counter the Butcher's powerful slashes, aiming for the legs and head while avoiding those indestructible arms. They're resistant to blunt, fire and bleed damage, making those damage forms less effective than normal. And if you thought all of that wasn't enough to make them a problem, they also just so happen to regenerate health by chomping away on nearby corpses, or lying around on the floor. If a Butcher suddenly decides to dash off during a fight, then that's probably what he's gone to do, so you'll definitely want to chase after him to try and stop that from happening, giving him a nice smack while he's distracted and open to attack. An even more ferocious variant of the Butcher comes in the form of the aptly named Vicious Butcher, which is even more hyper-aggressive than the standard one and is also covered in sharp objects and barbed wire embedded in their skin, so a little bit like the Spiky Walkers and Runner variants. These guys stand out from the crowd, having those green mohawks and looking like they've just been to a punk gig, and although they act in a similar way to the others, they're also prone to getting more pissed off after taking damage, going into an aggressive state, where they'll become even more hostile. It also doesn't necessarily need to run off to find dead bodies to devour, as it can regenerate its health even easier by chewing away at your flesh left behind on the butcher's arm spikes, allowing it to stay close by and keep topping up its health during a fight. So the nastiest, most devastating enemy you'll come across is the Mutator, the strongest Apex variant in the game, able to soak up tons of damage whilst also being able to inflict it, using several different close and long range attacks. These guys start off as normal walkers, typically bald dudes wearing green trousers, which heavily morph into huge monsters when you get nearby or when they're startled by a loud noise, such as an explosion. Their chest cavity splits open with their ribcage popping outwards, while a massive club-like growth emerges from their left arm, used to swing around and slam into the ground to deal high damage and create shockwaves on the floor. Although they're pretty menacing things to go up against in a short-range fight, mutators can be just as dangerous, if not more so, when they're further away, able to spit out a spread of dart-like bone projectiles which inflict bleed damage while knocking out huge chunks from your health bar. All of these attacks can be fatal if you're fairly low on health, making a mutator a very formidable opponent, which is why it can often be a good tactic to reserve some of your fury energy for their encounters, giving you a nice head start before battering them with those standard melee weapons. It'll take quite a few hits to put them down for good, and you're probably going to be best attacking them from close range, with the zombie being resistant to projectile damage, along with explosives too. So those are all the zombie types you can expect to see over the course of Dead Island 2's main campaign. Hope you enjoyed the guide, give me a thumbs up if you did, and subscribe if you want to see more enemy guides and other stuff just like this, which you'll be able to find on my channel. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll be seeing you in the next one.